Welcome to Military Analytics. The battle for the city of Bakhmut has become the most decisive part of the Ukrainian war. Both Ukraine and Russia have focused their efforts on this small industrial city in recent months. Despite the exhaustion of its ammunition stocks and the lack of motivation of its soldiers, Russia is attacking with all its might to make a tangible gain in the war that has been going on for more than a year. But it can't get past the steel curtain of Ukraine's defense. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, perfectly demonstrates its defensive capabilities while at the same time inflicting heavy damage on the Russian army with offensive operations. Let's examine the latest developments about the Bakhmut war together. In Bakhmut, the fighting continues, but Russian attacks are still low compared to recent weeks, and one of the most significant achievements of the recent Ukrainian operations was probably the repulsing of Russian Wagner Group fighters from the 0506 route. This secondary route of local importance has become a critical supply line for the Ukrainian defenders. The UK Ministry of Defense says Wagner was previously within a few hundred meters of the route. Also, there have been recent allegations that Wagner PMC has taken full control of the ESM industrial complex north of central Bakhmut. While the allegations are denied, this area will likely remain controversial, as it has been for the past 2 weeks. A shortage of personnel is likely to hinder Russia's offensive efforts in this sector, after the Wagner Group confirmed the release of at least 5,000 imprisoned fighters the previous day. The Eastern Group of the Armed Forces of Ukraine stated that the situation in the Bakhmut region is constantly difficult, but according to them, the Russian army does not have a strategic advantage. The Armed Forces of Ukraine previously stated that the main task of the defense forces located in Bakhmut in the Donetsk region is to exhaust overwhelming forces of the Russian Federation amid Western reports that Russian forces might be attempting to launch an offensive in other directions. The pace of Russian operations around Bakhmut was greatly reduced. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has warned that if his country does not win the long-running war in Bakhmut, Russia could begin to build international support for a deal that may require Ukraine. If Bakhmut falls into the hands of Russian forces, Russian President Vladimir Putin will best sell this victory to the West, his own society, and his allies. The Russian army is like a shark. If it smells blood and senses that the Ukrainian army is weak, it will attack more. Therefore, with the support of Western countries, the Ukrainian army should do its best in Bakhmut and stop the Russian advance here and consolidate its superiority in the war. So what about the war motivation of the Ukrainian army? In order not to show any weakness to the other side, the Ukrainian authorities, especially Zelensky, are in constant contact with the army. They listen to them, solve their problems, and make them feel that the soldiers are not alone in this way. The Ukrainian army was able to stand upright against the Russian army until this time, backed by much of the West. Ukraine surprised the world with the strength of its resistance against the larger, better-equipped Russian army. Ukrainian forces held their capital, Kiev, and drove Russia back from other strategically important areas. But as the first year of the Ukrainian war approaches, Ukrainian President Zelensky finds himself focused on keeping motivation high, both in his army and among the general Ukrainian population, especially the millions who have fled abroad and those who live in relative comfort and security away from the front lines. Zelensky is also well aware that his country's success is largely dependent on waves of international military support, particularly from the United States and Western Europe. But some in the US question whether Washington will continue to provide billions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine. Trump's likely Republican opponent, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, also argued that defending Ukraine in a territorial dispute with Russia is not a major U.S. national security priority. He later retracted the statement after facing criticism from other corners of the GOP on the subject. Zelensky did not mention the names of Trump or other Republican politicians he might have to deal with if they win in the 2024 election. However, he said he was concerned the war could be affected by changing political forces in Washington. The U.S. needs to understand that Ukraine cannot win the war if they stop doing it to Ukraine. President Zelensky has a very persuasive personality on such matters, as you may recall. Many weapons previously requested from Ukraine's Western partners were not accepted at first, and then with Zelensky's persuasion, they were given to the Ukrainian army. The most specific example of this is the Patriot batteries. While the U.S. did not want to give the Patriot batteries to Ukraine before, The Patriots have already been deployed to Ukraine. Zelensky's modern leadership qualities are not only recognized in foreign affairs but also across the country. Now a globally recognized face, Zelensky embarked on a morale-building journey to extend his considerable influence to areas close to the front lines. He traveled with a small staff of advisors and a large group of heavily armed security guards dressed in battlefield attire. His destinations included commemorations of the first anniversary of the liberation of towns in the Sumy region and visits with troops stationed at the frontline positions near Zaporizhia. Each visit was kept secret until he left. Zelensky recently made a similar visit near Bakhmut, where Ukrainian and Russian forces have been engaged in a crushing and bloody war for months. While some Western military analysts have suggested that the city is not of significant strategic importance, Zelensky warned that any casualties at this stage of the war could jeopardize Ukraine's tough momentum. The Ukrainian army must take its steps correctly. If it's a freshly baked pie on the fumes of war, it's the strawberry that flavors the pie in victory. Therefore, the Ukrainian army has to suffer the least losses and increase the losses of its opponent. Zelensky's comments were an admission that losing the 7-month Battle of Bakhmut, the longest war ever, would be a more costly political defeat than a tactical one. He predicted that the pressure of a defeat at Bakhmut would come quickly, both from the international community and from his home country. If Bakhmut is lost, Ukraine will feel tired, and the people will force Zelensky to compromise with the Russians. Zelensky says he has never felt this pressure until now. The international community has largely rallied around Ukraine after Russia launched the war. A parade of world leaders has visited Zelensky in Ukraine in recent months, and many travel in trains similar to those used by presidents to traverse the country. So what does Zelensky's general thoughts on the war? The Ukrainian president has few guesses about the biggest question on the war, how it will end. However, he expresses his confidence that his nation will prevail against a very large country, a great enemy, a great army in a series of small victories and small steps. Zelensky said that while the war accepted Ukraine, it eventually made his own society stronger. Zelensky could have gone on to somehow divide Ukraine or otherwise unite Ukraine, but he did not. He remained in his country since the beginning of the war, resisting the Russian forces with his soldiers and people, and is now more of a hero than a leader in his country. While he was a TV comedian for years ago, now trying to free a nation from captivity is not something that can be seen all the time. History is full of heroes who led and liberated their nation. And one of these heroes is now Zelensky. If Ukraine wins the war, it will increase its visibility in the international arena and become one of the important countries of the modern world, as it has a strong leaders such as Abraham Lincoln, Gandhi, and Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Wars have never been won by physical force. It is necessary to break the willpower of the opponent or the enemy, which is important in an encounter or conflict. And it's necessary to collapse it mentally. Unless this is achieved, you will not be victorious. And unless you give up, you will not be defeated. Ukrainians know this very well and manage to get out of helpets with willpower. On the other hand, it is very difficult to say the same for Russians. While the Ukrainians are fighting for a noble cause, the Russians are sent aimlessly to the front as cannon fodder. This difference is more than enough for Ukraine to run to victory as the most concrete result of this willpower of Ukraine. Although the Bakhmut front opened to the gates of hell, the Ukrainians were able to cope with it. On the other hand, the thought of the Russian soldiers is to fulfill their duties and, if possible, to escape from the front. However, this doesn't happen, and tens of thousands of Russians on the Bakhmut front are stuck aimlessly in the middle of hell. A city of 41 kilometers offers a clash arena to nearly 200,000 soldiers. This is the city of Bakhmut, the most critical front of the war between Ukraine and Russia in the steppes of Eastern Europe. If you've ever thought about how many soldiers were killed in this city, or how many were now fighting in the trenches in and around Bakhmut, then yes, you realize that this war is the most violent phenomenon that has affected Europe since World War II. It remains unclear exactly how many soldiers and civilians have been killed or injured in the city of Bakhmut to date. But the estimated numbers are quite tragic and horrific. It's estimated that a total of 190,000 people were killed or injured in the city of Bakhmut alone from February 24, 2022, when the clashes began. Despite all these heavy losses, clashes in the city still continue fiercely. Most recently, the Ukrainians made serious efforts to seize control of the Chromov highway northwest of Bakhmut. As a result of the clashes that took place a few days ago as a result of the heavy bombardment of the Ukrainian artillery brigade stationed near the highway, the Ukrainian armed forces began to hold the control of the Chromov highway to a large extent at the moment. But there is still a Russian threat in the region. On the other hand, the southwestern parts of Bakhmut are still quite active. Successful operations by the Ukrainian armed forces in the southwest of the city on the sides of Ivanivka woodlands and the crossover highway link road have yielded positive results in the last few days. In addition, the Ukrainians continuing their military preparations from the direction of Opytn in the south of Bakhmut and from Yagodny in the north have completely squeezed Bakhmut, which is described as the fortress of the war from 4 places. Yes, the Russians have also put into action their retaliation plans against the situation, but Ukraine seems to be in the foreground, both in terms of location advantage and numerical superiority. To understand this situation more clearly, we need to dig deep into the Bakhmut front line. The fiercest clashes are taking place in the city's central trenches and the borders of Bakhmut, currently occupied by highway areas within the borders of Bakhmut. 80,000 Russian soldiers are now helplessly in the middle of hell. They are completely helplessly trapped in the trenches as cannon fodder. At this point, we're faced with the most interesting part of the work because the military logistics to Bakhmut, where fierce trench warfare still continues, is most easily provided from the highways located in the northwest and southwest directions of the city. So the fact that so many Russian soldiers are now stuck in the Bakhmut swamp will perhaps decide the fate of the war. Bakhmut is one of the front lines that will determine this fate. On the other hand, these connecting roads are largely under the control of Ukrainians. But in the next few days it is possible that we can see the offensive actions of the mercenaries of the Wagner Group, especially on these connecting roads. The reason for this is that Russia does not have an effective area to even act in Bakhmut. Therefore, the Moscow administration will want to give the Russian army a sigh of relief by sending Wagner forces to the side of the connection roads around Bakhmut. But this situation is quite risky for the Russians because in the aforementioned areas, artillery units, special forces, and snipers of the Ukrainian armed forces are constantly on the alert. Unplanned realization of the idea of seizing the connection roads leading to Bakhmut by Russia or Wagner forces may cause difficult situations to come back. The reason for such a high-risk factor is that the Ukrainian army constantly receives military and financial support from the USA and Western Europe. On the other hand, the loss of approximately 3,500 battle tanks by the Russian army is one of the factors determining the direction of the clashes in Bakhmut. Because the Russian army has lost so many tanks, it's not effective enough against the Ukrainians in the trench battles in Bakhmut. According to this data, if we need to make a simple calculation, the Russian army has lost about 88 tank battalions on the territory of Ukraine since the beginning of the war. It's estimated that more than half of these tank losses occurred in the city of Bakhmut. Have you ever thought about the reasons why Russia lost so many tanks since the Second World War? The Russians have prepared many general situation reports on how to increase their defense industry by making cost calculations. In line with these reports, Russia began to thin the armor of the war tanks they produced. Since Russia does not value its own people and soldiers, the designs of the war tanks they produce are based on principles such as cheap and easy production. In addition, there is a very thin armor structure on the bottom layer which corresponds to the driver pedals of the Russian tanks. Even the RPG-7 hitting this area can destroy the tank if slightly more powerful systems are available. Effective shots can be made on the shield part of the tank around the driver optics. Also, as soon as you close the sight of the driver of Russian tanks, you can render the tank completely useless. In fact, the loss of soldiers in the Russian army is reaching record numbers due to critical reasons such as the easy destruction of Russian tanks on Ukrainian soil. In other words, the cheap and unstable war equipment cost the lives of Russian soldiers. The most impartial and most up-to-date assessments on this issue came from the United Kingdom, the superpower of Western Europe, and the United States, one of the biggest allies of Ukraine. From the Ukraine war to date, the Russian army and the private military company Wagner Group have killed and injured a total of more than 220,000 soldiers, according to the latest assessment by the UK Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, and the US intelligence community. Considering these striking numbers, there are some really important and deep systemic problems in the efforts of the Russian forces at the moment. This latest casualty is 20,000 higher than the previous Western assessment published in February. Indeed, since November, an average of more than 18,500 Russian casualties of dead and wounded soldiers nearly every month, more deadly than in the previous month. In other words, the current Russian losses are more than the occupation force that attacked Ukraine on February 24, 2022. This alone is the clearest proof that Russian President Vladimir Putin's special military operation against his little neighbor has so far failed spectacularly. On the other hand, until recently, Western casualty estimates tended to be more conservative than Ukraine's claims. Indeed, the West estimates that Russian forces have lost about 1,900 main battle tanks. But the Ukrainians argue that Russian forces have lost about 2 times as many battle tanks to date. Much more confusing, then, is the discrepancy in the number of killed and injured. Ukrainians use the word liquidated to refer to Russian losses. However, this choice of words symbolizes the actual dead and wounded figure. Judging from Ukraine's claims in other categories of Russian losses, such as main battle tanks, we can reasonably consider that the Ukrainians, when using the term liquidated, means killed. Because this method of assessment means that Ukrainians do not take into account the wounded Russians. Standard military wisdom indicates that for 1 dead there are 2 or 3 wounded. Therefore, adding the wounded into the Russian army brings the total estimate of Russian losses to 680,000 dead and wounded, which would be in line with the estimates of material losses. In summary, as long as this war, which has deeply affected Eastern Europe, continues, we will be able to see almost double or much more of these numbers, especially in the Bakhmut front line and in other trenches in Ukraine, because the weather will warm up in a very short time and clashes will increase considerably. The developments in the Russia-Ukraine war have raised many questions along with many problems. The most important of these questions was, why is it fought? Russian soldiers have been asking themselves this question since the day Putin began his occupation of Ukraine. Why are we at war with Ukraine? Russian soldiers find it difficult to answer this question because war is a struggle for the independence and territorial integrity of a country. But is that what Russian soldiers are fighting for? Before answering this important question in detail, we have a reminder. As a daily news team, we continue to report all developments in the Russia-Ukraine war with an impartial and accurate journalism approach. You can support our team, which strives for the realization of these works, by clicking the Super Thanks button. Russian soldiers do not even know what they are fighting for, in which region they are fighting with, whom they are fighting, and against whom they are fighting, such that Russian soldiers who surrendered to Ukrainian troops admitted in their statements that they did not even recognize their commanders at the front and did not know that they were fighting with Ukraine. This is because the vast majority of Russian soldiers are sent to the occupied territories under pretenses of training and terrorism. In the first month of Putin's occupation of Ukraine, the Russians who opposed the occupation predicted these developments. Therefore, in the second month of the occupation of Ukraine, anti-occupation Russians formed a group. Moreover, this group was formed under the Ukrainian armed forces. This group, called the Free Russian Legion, was formed when anti-war Russians sought refuge in Ukraine. The aim of the Legion was to stop the occupation of the Russian army in Ukraine. This meant that Russians were fighting their own citizens. The Russians, who crossed from Russia to Ukraine, defected to the Ukrainian army, stating that they disagreed with Putin's unjust occupation decision and wanted to stop Russia's advance in Ukraine and join the Ukrainian resistance. The Free Russian Legion, which was formed with about 100 people, has now exceeded 1,000. A new development in recent days has further strengthened the Free Russian Legion in the city of Bakhmut, where the Russian-Ukrainian war was fiercest. A major development took place recently. A group of Russian soldiers in Bakhmut, together with their commanders, laid down their weapons and joined the Free Russian Legion. The soldiers and commanders who concealed their identities stated that they are not afraid of Russian leader Vladimir Putin and his occupying army. They made this decision because of their experiences on the front line. Russian soldiers said that the Russian state and army do not care about their lives. They explained that Putin had hundreds of thousands of his citizens killed for his own political interests. Therefore, they said they would work to prevent the Russian army's advance in Ukraine. When the Free Russian Legion first informed the Ukrainian armed forces that they wanted to establish a presence on Ukrainian territory, the Ukrainian army was greatly concerned because the Legion would be made up of Russians and would grow with Russian participation. This would allow agents to hide under the umbrella of the Legion. For this reason, the Ukrainian armed forces decided to control Russians who wanted to join the Legion with a detailed examination and constant supervision. Because the Free Russian Legion was a great opportunity for Russian invaders to infiltrate Ukrainian territory. But Ukrainian authorities and commanders took a series of measures to prevent this possibility. Under Ukrainian law, it was forbidden for a Russian citizen to join the Ukrainian armed forces. Andrei Yusov, spokesman for the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Service, announced that this law was changed after the measures taken and that joining the Free Russian Legion was made legal. The most striking of these measures was a polygraph testament. Every Russian who wanted to join the Legion had to take a lie detector testament. The Russians who passed the test were put through a very comprehensive and difficult training. Russians who were trained in the use of weapons, tanks, mortars, and missile systems, as well as emergency response and escape from captivity, and who were successful in these trainings were entitled to join the Legion. Yusov explained the purpose of the creation of the Free Russian Legion as follows. There were many Russians who could not really remain indifferent because of their moral principles and were looking for a way to join the ranks of the Ukrainian defenders. All the legionnaires came with a great desire to stop Putin's horde and liberate Russia from dictatorship. As a result of these developments, the Free Russian Legion has been resisting the Russian occupiers for a year without any problems. Young people with pseudonyms, Zazar and Cesar, are among the Russians fighting against the occupiers. Russian teenagers, pseudonyms Zarza and Cesar, who did not want to fight against the Ukrainians together with the Russian invaders, openly explained why they joined the Free Russian Legion. Russian teenagers use aliases to avoid giving their names. This is because their families continue to live in Russia. They hide their identities to avoid any trouble for their families. Zarza says that Russia has been doing everything it can to end the occupation since the first day it started to occupy Ukraine. Zarza 20 says that while living in Russia, he made a series of posts on his social media accounts, calling on Putin to abandon his decision to invade Ukraine. But as a result of these posts, Russian police knocked down Zaza's door and warned him. Zaza knows that if he continues to post against the Russian occupation on social media, the Russian police will take him from his home and put him in jail. So he thinks that he should not go to jail and do something to prevent the occupation. And eventually, Zaza joins the Free Russian Legion. Zaza explains the purpose of joining the Free Russian Legion is as follows. We are not here to prove anything. We are here to help the Russian forces to complete the withdrawal from Ukrainian territory and to help Russia to be free of Putin in the future at such a young age. It is a bit early to talk about my political views and worldview because they are just forming. But when your country is taken over by an evil man, you have to take everything into your own hands. Another name who joined the Free Russian Legion is Caesar. Caesar is a pseudonym like Zazar. Caesar, 50, says he joined the Legion because he could not tolerate all the inhumane behavior of Russia in Ukraine. He believes that a true Russian should not rape children, kill women, and fight against civilians. But Caesar witnessed these developments and left his hometown of St. Petersburg. Since joining the Free Russian Legion, Caesar confesses that he has killed many invaders and that he feels no remorse or guilt for his actions because he believes that there is no other way to prevent the Russian invaders. The members of the Free Russian Legion who fought against the Russian occupiers have achieved serious success in the war, thanks to the training they received in Kiev. The members of the Legion who were actively involved in almost all of the occupied territories say that they will not leave the region until Putin gives up his plans to occupy Ukraine.